the Crusades. A mark on the Roman Catholic Church in history. Shameful. Genocide. A Catholic Holocaust.
What?
No, all right. I know that sounds bad.
Really? Let's talk about it. Hi, welcome to The Catholic Skeptic. My name is Hugh. Glad you could join me today. We're going to talk today about the Crusades. Interesting experience in the history of the church, history of Christianity, history of the Catholic Church in particular, and one that just has such a reaction from people. There's so many people who just off the cuff assume the most horrible things about the Crusades. It is thought of as in many ways like a Catholic genocidal move and a conquering bloody conquest of war and violence purported by the church. Hollywood movies portray the Catholic side of the conflict always as this sort of dark ages, medieval darkness of response, and oftentimes the opposite side, the Islamic side, is portrayed as just so wonderful and tolerant and open and beautiful. People in education are taught all sorts of things. Selective history is often taught. One of my own pet peeves about modern education day, of course, is the notion of the textbook and the we talk about in the video world. You have sound bites, just like quick little quotations. Well, there's sort of verb bites, printed verb bites in textbooks, which you often have just little historical things and without any context being filled in. And the Crusades are a very misunderstood topic. First of all, when you look at the history of Christianity, 2,000 years back, and from the time of Christ and his death, and we as Catholics and Christians believe the resurrection, Christianity was spread by preaching, spread by evangelism. The Christians were greatly persecuted. Christ obviously was persecuted himself and put to death on the cross. There was lots of persecution off and on throughout the Roman Empire. There was all kinds of things. But because Jesus had in the Sermon on the Mount talked about things like turn the other cheek and love your enemy, there was never a militant response on the part of Christians for a long time. I say never, as in for centuries, really. There was not often a military reaction to things. St. Augustine, of course, wrote his just war theory, which is a principle that's primarily a Catholic teaching, that there are times when it is necessary to go to war, when it's defensive, when it's just to save your life and your home and freedom and things of this nature. That just means should be fought in a defensive manner. There are certain things along these lines, but that took time to develop, even as an understanding, and of course, for the centuries before that, the Christians had no position of authority. There were no, quote, Christian nations at that point. There were, but there was no authority of, that wasn't necessarily dealing with that until when Constantine made Christianity the official religion of Rome, of course, then, and painted Christian symbols on his shields in the sign conquer, as he believed God had directed him in a dream revision. That was the case. But Christianity, this is how Christianity was understood for a long time. Now, 600 years after Christianity, Islam was founded, and Muhammad, in his preaching, was persecuted as well. There was persecution against Muhammad because Islam has a strong focus on one God and an opposition to the polytheism and paganism that was all around them at the time, and what they were facing. They experienced great persecution for standing for principles like there being one God and that. But of course, in Muhammad's case, of course, he retaliated by organizing armies and by fighting against that persecution with physical war. And sort of took up arms first in terms of a religious choice of a religion to take up arms. But as a result of that Islamic, Islam as a religion extended to multiple areas. They began to govern, several areas. The Middle East, the Near East, the nation of Spain, several places where Islam was just spreading all over the place in a strong manner. Now, of course, there was retaliation by then amongst the various Christian nations. the Franks, the Normans, the Holy Roman Empire existed and did kind of create a blockade or a bulwark blockade to try and block that expansion from continuing. But as far as a church-orientated, directed notion of that, of any sort of war thing, there wasn't anything going on for a long time. But there were things that were happening, pilgrims to the Holy Land. Now, when I say pilgrims, Catholic may understand that term, Protestants may not. Pilgrimage meaning making a pilgrimage to holy places, traveling, not pilgrims like as in the pilgrims who came to America, but pilgrimaging, traveling to find holy places, and that. Trips to the Holy Land, so to speak, that exists today in tour form, that existed in those days too in a certain format, and there were attacks and raids on pilgrims and things that did take place. There were various different things that were taking place. But what began to happen was the Byzantine Empire was beginning to be unable to uphold when they were in battle. And so the Emperor Alexius of the Byzantine Empire asked Pope Urban II for help, petitioned the Pope for help to bring forces to bear and sort of join the fight. Now, Pope Urban was a reformer of the tradition of Hildebrand. He was very much a reformer, pope, very, very holy pope. I know many of our Protestant audience, they say, well, the popes were all evil. There were bad popes. Catholics have no problem admitting that. My Protestant friends seem to think that's a gotcha moment when they point out some wicked thing a pope did. Yes, and when I point out wicked things some Protestants have done, I always get, balked at, like, oh, that's not really. Yeah, it is. There's evil done on both sides and all sides in any of these situations, absolutely. But Pope Urban was a holy man, and Pope Urban took an entire year to essentially seek God, to seek prayer and counsel before he would even get involved. That's how slow he was to move on taking action in the Crusades. But when action was finally taken, when the Pope did call for in essence that's a holy war to fight the spread, it was for defensive reasons. It was a defensive action. The Byzantines that were being attacked, there had been pilgrims being attacked. The Muslims did control the Holy Land. There were things going on that were required for defensive purposes. And so the call for help was answered. Pope Urban II was a beloved pope, and people came up and answered the call. Many of them, not experienced soldiers and everything else in the beginning, wanted to answer the call to go and fight. There was a desire, of course, to protect holy places, to have access and freedom to places like the tomb of Christ, the Holy Sepulchre, which is the tomb of Christ, the birthplace of Jesus, to go to Bethlehem, to go to all these different places, to see these holy sites. Of course, there's holy sites in what is modern Israel today that are attended by Christians and Jews and Muslims to all various holy places that are located in West. Why we refer to that area as a holy land. As well as all kinds of other issues and geopolitical issues, which we're not getting into remotely in this video. But the idea, though, of bringing a war of defense was the initial purpose of the Crusades. Now, there are more than one crusade. We're not going to go into great historical detail on all the Crusades. We're going to talk mainly about that first crusade to start off with. Now, this crusade was called for this purpose, and many of the people answering that call had very deep spiritual desires to come and help and to serve. They were badly organized. They weren't real good at what they were doing. They had to raise their own finances to support this thing. Eventually, Norman and Frankish nobles and knights got involved as well and became kind of the generals and organizers. So, but in the beginning, that was not the case. It was sloppy at the beginning. Right. But its purpose was very, very much defensive. And that's an important understanding because, when you look back on historical events, it's very easy, of course, in the current culture to anything that's European must be evil or something like that has become a prominent thing. But I mean, even other things. I mean, most people that I know don't actually react critically to the invasion of Normandy in World War II. When General Eisenhower and the Allied generals decided on D-Day, June 6, 1944, for all Allied forces to invade for the beaches of France that Germany was controlling and begin to fight to take back those areas and defeat the Nazis. That most people look back on that as any kind of a bad thing. And ironically, Eisenhower, later became President Eisenhower of the United States, Eisenhower's book on the subject, which I have read, is called Crusade in Europe. So he called it a crusade, and he had no problem at that point to even identify it as a crusade. But and then there have been preachers like Protestant preacher Billy Graham who referred to his gospel rallies as crusades. But there are some people who find that word just offensive. Oh, it's a crusade. That's just the wrong thing about. But honestly, you don't think of a defensive war in that wicked manner. Now clearly in World War II, you can definitely see things that were done wrong on the Allied side. There are things that were done in the name of war that are awful. There is collateral damage. There are abuses of power. There are things that took place. In World War II, for example, you have the Battle of Dresden, where Allied forces dropped bombs on Germany in a civilian area, where it was known that children and families were being just air raided with these bombs, and it's kind of a dark spot on the Allied side of World War II. There are things like this that have taken place. I mean, it's a very real thing. And please understand, in this video, we're not whitewashing over the fact that there were some atrocities and abuses taking place in the Crusade, because it went on decade after decade after decade. There were things that took place. But the abuses were done by individual groups within the Crusade. They were done by groups of knights, sometimes, or groups of individuals who took things into their own hands. They were not ordered by the Pope. In fact, the Pope actually excommunicated several groups of knights and who had crusaders who had violated terms and had done abusive things. But there was a desire to achieve defensive victory. Now, of course, part of that involves invading territories. And I'm saying, well, the Crusaders invaded many of these Muslim territories. Well, understand that those areas were originally Christian territories that were first invaded by the other side. So there was a taking back of areas. That was the case. But so that was certainly part of the deal. But it was operative in a defensive manner. That's what took place in this time. It was not done, again, with the spirit of conquest. There were people formed like the Knights Templar that are well known and famous, and of course are always portrayed as a dark conspiratorial order that was out to do that. These were knight monks who were knights. They took vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience. Only unlike traditional monks who stayed in the monastery and prayed and worked, these went to war. But they did so living a holy life. Now, of course, there were, bad examples in that group, and there were the ones that did. They also got involved with banking and some things they shouldn't have, and so there were things that were done wrong again. But they were not initially the desire of it. The desire of it was to liberate areas, to restore, peace in these areas. So Christians could pray and worship and do things of this nature. These things were all part and parcel of what the Crusades were about. All right, it was motivated very strongly by this, and at least initially. Now again, crusade after crusade took place, and there were things, I said, committed that weren't right, that were done. But it was not a desire to. It wasn't a desire to annihilate the Jews. It wasn't a desire to just take booty, so to speak, to collect, to plunder and things of that nature. Things around them. There was actually liberation of slavery that had taken place, and that people who had become enslaved. There were all sorts of things that took place during the Crusades. So none of it was designed in a manner that was geared toward the sudden aggressive desire to launch out on conquest. As I said, the church avoided being involved for the longest time possible. And again, even Pope Urban, when he was first requested for help from Alexius, the emperor of the Byzantine Empire, did not respond right away. It took him a good year to seek it out. I'm sure he sought counsel and as well from others, as well as prayers as to whether this was the right action to take. But understand, Christianity as a whole, although a pacifistic mindset, often affected Christians, especially during the early persecutions of the first few centuries of the church, in terms of not retaliating and that. There was an understanding from the teachings of Christ that it was not meant to be pacifism in a purest sense of the word. The very teaching Jesus gave, if anyone strikes you on the one cheek, turn them off the other as well, was not so much a principle of assault as insult. It was a challenge. The open-handed strike of someone in the face was a challenge, and that Jesus is reminding us we don't have to involve ourselves in these challenges. The quote challenge to a duel kind of thing. You don't have to respond and enter into contracted violence with someone over petty insults or things of this nature. But he certainly was not a call to say you couldn't defend yourself if you're attacked or defend your family. I don't know many, Christian men, for example, and yes, I will, use the gender term men, but women as well, but men who would not defend their home or their family if someone tried to hurt their wife or their children, and be violent if necessary to respond. There's no notion that Jesus commended the Roman centurion as a man of great faith, but he didn't say, now make sure you get rid of your service in the Roman Empire. Don't be a soldier anymore. Wasn't told that. When John the Baptist in the Gospel of Luke was asked, when he asked people to bring forth fruits of repentance, what should we do? And he would say things like, you have 2 coats to give someone who doesn't have any, and to give to the poor. And he told the tax collectors not to take more than that was due to them. When the soldiers asked him, what should we do? He said, he said, don't do anything violence wrongfully to someone. In other words, don't use your sword and your uniform, your armor as a means of intimidation. And he didn't deny, however, that it was acceptable to have legal enforcement. The New Testament, of course, Romans chapter 13, speaks of those who bear the sword in the land as they bear not the sword in vain, that they're God's ministers to execute judgment upon the ungodly and the wicked. Now, obviously, we know that often is abused and has been at different times in history, but the principle of the just necessity of something like both law enforcement and defense of one's country in war is perfectly understandable in a Christian view. But the Crusades are often portrayed in a very different way. A genuine atrocity or bad action is picked out by a group of knights or something, or a battalion or something, and then it's implied, well, this is what the all Crusades were all about, and this was the order that was given. No, it was not. There was not fundamentally something that was done. As I said earlier, the Pope excommunicated several who had engaged in these kinds of practices. But that wasn't the norm of practice. There were some individuals who went to the Crusades and walked around Jerusalem barefoot praying. All right, just praying. Before any action, before any battle began. There was a common desire of serving Christ in the middle of these situations. Was it the best? Probably not. Not the best way to handle things. It's hard to say the Knights Templar, the idea of monk knights who fought rather than just prayed. That's a distortion of what monasticism is about. But they were there. There were the Hospitallers. There were another group of knights who engaged in similar practice. But there are many who joined that out of great sincerity. And people didn't want to leave their home. There wasn't a notion of, well, if I leave my home and my family and in safety to go fight in this battle, I'm somehow going to become rich and wealthy and plunder all the gold or whatever. Life was precarious and dangerous, as even as Thomas Hobbes said of his time, more so probably in the middle times, nasty, brutal, nasty life was nasty, brutish, and short. It was dangerous. You weren't, anxious to go off into some serious situation, except you had sincere motives to want to do it. That there was a desire to serve God in the process, and the Crusades were like that. This is how the Crusades were conducted, initially. I'm saying, but again, yes, was there some attempts to take advantage and use that in an abusive way? Were there times when there were so-called Christian soldiers in the Crusade acting abusive toward those that they were liberating and or Yeah, sure, there were evils that were done, most definitely, but there's a very big difference. And it's something we have to understand in historical principles anyway, between the abuse of a good system and the use of a bad system. All right. If you believe, for example, if you look at American history, you may believe the principles of the Declaration of Independence that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights to life, liberty, and happiness. But they often cry today, well, those were just the wealthy white property-owning, slave-holding people. And first of all, they were not all that. Many of them didn't own slaves at all. But either way, I guess, yes, that didn't mean that the principle inscribed in the Declaration wasn't an inspiring principle. It inspired many other nations down through history. And certainly it has taken and is still taking the United States time to live up to that ideal. But the principle is a very good principle. Because Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder. Yes, Thomas Jefferson was a slaveholder, but Thomas Jefferson felt very tormentingly guilty about it. George Washington owned slaves, but he put provision in his will that they should all be freed. And there were many other founding fathers like John Adams and Benjamin Franklin who didn't own slaves at all. Alexander Hamilton didn't own slaves. Ben Franklin proudly, of course, boasted he was founded one of the first abolitionist societies in the North American continent. So, but again, obviously that's not time of the Crusades, but I'm using these as examples. There will be abuses in an ideal. There will be abuses in things that are wrong. But the notion that the entire thing was just an awful, horrible, black mark and dark chapter in Christianity would not be an accurate thing at all. Many of the principles of chivalry and honor and fighting for what's right, and inspirations of literature, of all sorts of things that came out at that time that inspired people after that centuries came out of that notion of fighting for a noble cause. There's a mindset. And I knew I'd seen this a lot in college, in formally studying history, the religious wars. But I've heard other people comment quite with a quite good argument. The only war worth fighting in one sense is a religious war, not in the sense that you're warring to make people turn to your religion, which is what it's always interpreted as. Again, sometimes that's what motivates it, but a religious war in the sense that, in other words, a cause that's deep and moral and something that you believe in with all your heart is worthwhile, whether it be a fight for freedom or liberation of the oppressed, or whether it's that there's a motivation there that comes from a religious spirit, so to speak. It's just that notion of that, and those are the things worth fighting for. The belief that that when you believe that you are endowed by your Creator with certain unalienable rights, versus just believing, well, we kind of have sort of come to this sort of conclusion on our own and observation that freedom is probably better than oppression, and maybe this would be our preference. Kindness is preferable to cruelty or something like that. But no, the foundation of spiritual and religious motivations is a major cause in anything at all. And again, the initial start of the Crusade, Pope Urban was a very good pope and very, very faithful. And then, there were bad popes, My Protestant friends sometimes think that let's just dismiss the whole thing. Well, again, just like the people I have right in here, where they take the priest abuse scandals and turn it into millions. I have people writing me millions and millions of priests. It's like, no, it's not millions. There have been several, and it is atrocious and disgusting and vile that any priest did these sort of things, and even more atrocious than any bishop would dare cover it up. I agree fully. What we often don't hear in the media, of course, is that there's just as many Protestant ministers and Jewish rabbis who've done the same thing. That in the educational field, it's double. The abuse of teachers to students is double what that is to the clergy. But nobody seems to cry for, let's tear down all forms of education and destroy all schools. That's not usually the cry for that. But man, you sure with the Catholic Church, it's like, let's destroy this infamous, horrible place that has all these evils being done. There's evil's been done. There's evil people who will stand before the judgment seat of Christ and receive their comeuppance for this. This is a vile, horrifying thing, and God's judgment and wrath will be leveled out in these situations. But to understand that all acts of war are not wrong, they're not. There are times when there are noble causes. There are noble fights to be fought. There are noble battles to be fought. And so understanding that principle is there. And the Crusades have a very rich understanding of this at that time frame, that were very much a part of what that battle was all about. So we don't want to think in terms of these, the Crusades as something to hang our head in shame with. In fact, most of the time when people bring up Crusades, as one my brother Catholics had pointed out in one of their videos on the subject, that when you press them, when did the Crusades occur? The first Crusade was called by Pope Urban in 1095. But they don't know that. They don't know when it happened. They don't exactly when. They don't know the conditions that happened. They just have this sort of vague image of dark evil knights, sort of like you see in movie scenes, coming in and riding in and just slaughtering people all over the place. That was not by far anything like what that was about. What that was about. Again, that doesn't mean there weren't evils done. So don't write me a thousand, oh yeah, this happened. Yes, bad things did happen. But the understanding of it was, and if Protestants write it, I'm always amused because there's just as many things done in terms of that. Watch my videos on Protestantism. Watch the kind of Christian police state organized under John Calvin in Geneva. Why did Luther not side with the peasants in the wars of his era? Why was there? There are all sorts of things in historical context that Catholics and Protestants have both engaged in at times. But they're not black marks on history by any means. They're not some terrible thing that we want to cover up or hide from or run from. Like there's nothing in it. There was many good things that came out of these battles, or many good things that occurred. Not the least of which was preserving principles of liberty and freedom that were understood as well. Because yes, that is the case. There are the understanding of being able to worship God and to go to the holy places in peace, and these were vital motivations. It's interesting too that Pope Urban was petitioned by the Emperor Alexius of the Byzantine Empire, because this was again 1095 when Pope Urban called for the Crusade. It was in 1054, only 1054, a short time before that the schism took place between the Catholic and the Orthodox Church, when they ceased to be one and became separate churches. This great schism occurred. But understand that we look at that as something that's been going on for 1,000 years. And there's still been strides and there've been setbacks in terms of healing that break between East and West. But it's interesting, at the time that happened, nobody thought it was going to last on either side. Everybody thought this was a temporary thing. It would be a short time, which is why Emperor Alexius had no problem petitioning the Pope, because there was no thought then that even though there had been a sundering with the Catholic Church and the Orthodox Church, who still are extremely close in doctrine to this day, there was a thought that this would probably be restored soon. They just didn't know how long it was going to take. It's kind of rather like the people in the in the Battle of First Manassas, Bull Run in the Civil War, the civilians who brought their picnic baskets out to watch the battle. There were many people, several people in the area who came to watch the battle, and of course ran in terror as they saw the battle actually unfold. What real war was really like. But they just assumed, well, this is going to last very long. Nobody dreamed the American Civil War would last the years that it lasted. But so nobody understands, in the midst of war, what warfare really is like. But there was no thought that this schism between the two churches was going to continue. So that's all part of this entire situation as well. As I said, as the Crusades developed, the Franks and the Normans and others began to send their knights. And again, understand that a knight in that era, in that time frame, in those centuries, it wasn't just the guy in armor who fought. A knight was someone who had the provision of rule. It was an order. In medieval society, you did have a class system, but it was an interesting one. It wasn't proletariat versus bourgeoisie or anything like that. A communist thing. It was the order of those who prayed, monks, nuns, priests, such as that, and the order of those who worked, who labored, peasants, all the various peasants, and then there was the order of those who fight. Those were the knights. And the knights also were the ones who owned the castles, usually of some type of estate, and had access to servants, and had the armor, and they fought, but they were kind of rulers as well as fighters. Right? Not that every ruler was a fighter, but many of the knights were initially. And so many of them, when they began to take up the cause of the Crusades, they brought in greater military training and provision for the soldiers. The Knights Templar, again, going back to them, although they didn't live a life of silent prayer and that the way a modern Trappist monk would live, they were knights. Their asceticism consisted of military training and toughness and strategy and battle. And again, I know that some people in their mindset acquaint, again, being a Christian with, there's no war. No, they were also take vows of poverty out of chastity and obedience, just like any monk would. All right, so this, these realms coexist. I know the Catholic author, convert to Catholicism, and writer G.K. Chesterton, who debated guys like H.G. Wells and George Bernard Shaw and that, and held to his Catholic understanding back in the 1920s and 30s and that. G.K. Chesterton used to say that it always fascinated him that the anti-religious books that were written by the atheistic skeptics and that. He said they always would attack Christianity on two levels all the time. They would on the one hand, they would advocate for promiscuity and things of this nature, didn't understand the idea of marriage, and that. And on the other hand, they'd also attack the church for its emphasis on celibacy. Why are the clergy celibate? You have celibate clergy, and you have celibate monks and nuns, and not understanding from the Catholic perspective, we have the sacrament of marriage and the belief that marriage is indissoluble in a serious effort. And of course, the Catholic provision of against artificial contraception, the idea that there should be fruitfulness and multiplying and having children. So, can you have it both ways? Yeah. So you had those who would, there is the virtue of turning the other cheek, of loving one's enemy, but there's also the virtue of taking up arms and battling for your family and for your faith and for your country, and that as well. Both principles coexist together very operatively in Christian theology and in Catholic theology. And it's not that big a stretch to understand that. But again, what usually happens from someone outside of it is everything gets meshed together. Everything gets all thrown in the same pot. There's no distinctions. That's why things like the papal infallibility doctrine that we hold that freaks people out. Does that mean that you Catholics believe everything the Pope says? You have to do whatever he says. That's not what that means. It doesn't mean the Pope can't ever make a mistake or doesn't ever make mistakes in life. It's a principle of spiritual negative protection, as we talked about before, whether the Pope, when declaring something ex cathedra from the chair in authority, will not err on a subject, doesn't mean he'll always teach everything in detail right either. That's why you have, and every practice and tradition in the church is not capital T sacred tradition. There are small t tradition as well. So even though Catholics will argue about the changes in liturgy and things of this nature, and there are good arguments on both sides of those arguments, but the fact is, they really don't, in spite of the fact that some think they do, they don't determine the validity or invalidity of, let's say, the Catholic Mass. These things change. Traditions change over time. They are traditions, and there are many beautiful traditions and wonderful traditions that enhance one's faith and one's walk, and altering that can be a problem. All right, but that doesn't, it doesn't symbolize, see, they're all messed up now. They taught one thing one way, one thing the other way, and that, we need to make sure that we understand that there are some very, very definitive distinctions there, and looking back historically on the Crusades is a good way to do that, because we're understanding, first of all, the Crusades. And of course I do have a video out called Protestant Lies of History, where we deal with Galileo and several other, the Inquisition, some other aspects of history where there's a lot of great misunderstanding. But there's always a tendency, whenever there's lots of details, to push it aside. A lot of people prefer to read a pamphlet over a book. They prefer a soundbite over a full speech. They prefer, they don't want details of information. They just want a general overview. And if the overview has an anti-Catholic flavor to it, then it's easy to pick out a few things that are bad and just pile everything on that. And the other way as well. We can always look at certain individuals and groups and just immediately assume certain things based on hearsay, based on gossip. I mean, I have one individual who actually wrote me on here, make reference. Well, I heard a priest say in an interview once. And then he followed up by all these evil things this priest said the Catholic Church did. Well, so what? There are Catholic priests that say a lot of squirrely, weird things at times. Every priest isn't faithful. Every spokesman isn't faithful either. That's why you should search it for yourself. So I encourage you to really research something and not just assume that maybe what you were taught in school or college was the answer to that question. Look into greater detail. And I may continue with a second video at some point on giving more detail on this than I have. This has just been a very light overview. But just the initial principles of understanding that the First Crusade was initially a defensive war, that the actions of the Crusades were motivated by defense, by recovery of Holy Land, by helping individuals. It was not motivated by conquest. And I understand when I use the word motivated. It doesn't mean there wasn't some of that happening. It doesn't mean there weren't abuses that took place. But that was not the intention. It wasn't this wicked action of the evil Catholic Church. All right. In fact, its intentions were very good and very honorable. Right, there were again as it went on, because the Crusades went on the first, second Crusade, third Crusade, fourth Crusade, things got rougher. There were more problems, and as I said, I think we will do a second video going in a little more detail, more historical detail on that. But I want you to understand this basic overview just as a start. At any rate, I hope you enjoyed it. Please hit like and subscribe. Keep the comments coming, good, bad, and ugly. That's fine. I am going to say this about, although to my dear commentator friends that write in, especially those of you who are Protestant, we can dialogue. We can have lots of good conversation with each other and through the whole process. But when you pile on with the anti-Catholic bigotry shots and mockery and the insults, I ignore you over time. We say, I pray for you, but I ignore you. And in a few cases, some individuals have been blocked because they just got too darn nasty. Not that many, but a few. So that's not. We don't need that sort of kind of nonsensical hostility. Comment, as much as you want, and you can disagree all you want. I love it when people disagree. Comment. That's fine. But let's have dialogue. And again, I don't see all of the comments because too many come in on such a large level. I will not see all of them. I don't have that kind of time in the day to see every single one of them, but I do see several. When I do, I do respond, and I have had some very wonderful back and forth with some of you. That's been great. Others not so great. But either way, as I've often said, every time you come and every time you watch, you're helping grow the channel, whether you like it or not. So feel free to keep commenting. All right. That's enough for now. God bless. We'll see you all soon. And again, for the next one. All right. Thanks for watching.